There is a town in America where the post office approved the name only after every other option was rejected. Can you guess the town's name? Well, the town is called Nameless. America has over 30,000 named populated places. And somewhere along the way, somebody looked at a patch of land, a river crossing, a failed survey, a baking powder company, and made a decision that would outlast everyone in the room. These names didn't happen by accident. Most of them did. Some happened by exhaustion. Some by grief. Some by a joke that nobody stopped in time. Here's what nobody tells you. The stranger the name, the richer the story underneath it. Every bizarre town name in this country is a fossil, a perfect, preserved record of exactly who was here, what went wrong, and what they refused to let go of. 10 towns. 10 names that will make you question everything. And before we're done, you'll understand something about America that most people never think to ask. If you've never subscribed to this channel, this is the video that should change that. Because what's coming next will genuinely shock you. We start with the least weird, and we end with a town so surreally, heartbreakingly named that you'll want to tell someone about it before the video is even over. Number 10, Boring, Oregon. The most exciting lie in American geography. What if the most interesting town in the Pacific Northwest spent over a century pretending to be the most boring? Boring, Oregon doesn't apologize for its name. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't whisper it. Puts it on road signs, school letterheads, fire trucks, and festival banners and dares you to laugh first. Here's what most people get wrong. Boring was never meant to be a joke. The town was named after William H. Boring, a Union Army veteran who settled here in the 1870s, filed land claims, and became prominent enough that when the post office needed a name in 1903, his surname was the obvious choice. William Boring was not boring. He survived the Civil War. He carved a homestead out of the Oregon wilderness. He built something from nothing. The irony was never intentional. It simply aged that way. And then, instead of running from it, Boring leaned in completely. In 2012, Boring officially partnered with Dull, Scotland. A verified, legally documented sister city agreement between two places whose names became a global news story overnight. The BBC covered it. CNN picked it up. Then Blantyre in New South Wales, Australia joined the alliance, forming what is formally called the League of Extraordinary Communities. 3 countries, 3 towns. One shared commitment to making the world laugh at something completely real. Boring sits in Clackamas County, roughly 20 miles southeast of Portland, close enough to feel the pulse of a major city, far enough to keep its own identity. The landscape around it is anything but its name. Mount Hood looms in the near distance. The Sandy River runs nearby. The Cascade Range forms the eastern horizon. On a clear morning, Boring, Oregon looks like a painting someone made up. The town holds Boring and Dull Day every August, a genuine annual festival with vendors, live music, and a population that temporarily swells as tourists arrive specifically to photograph the town sign. That sign, at the intersection of Boring Road and Highway 212, is one of the most photographed road signs in the entire state of Oregon. People drive hours for it. Here's the fact that reframes everything. Boring's population has grown steadily. Property values have risen. People are choosing to move to a town called Boring and staying there. Because underneath the joke is something genuinely livable. Good schools, quiet streets, Portland commutable, community that knows itself. William H. Boring gave this town his name without knowing what it would become. What it became is a place that turned its greatest liability into its most recognizable asset. That is, quietly, one of the most interesting things any American town has ever done. And we're just getting started. Number 9. Intercourse, Pennsylvania. Before you laugh, first understand that Intercourse, Pennsylvania has been standing longer than the United States of America. This community existed before the Constitution was signed, before Washington crossed the Delaware, before this country had a name to put on a map. And it has outlasted every joke ever made about it. Intercourse sits in the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, one of the oldest and most densely settled agricultural regions in North America. The Pennsylvania Dutch came here in the early 1700s, German-speaking Anabaptists fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and they built something so deeply rooted that 3 centuries later, it is still functionally intact. The old order Amish communities surrounding Intercourse today are not a tourist recreation. They are a living, breathing continuation of a way of life that predates the American Revolution. The name itself is the first mystery. The most widely accepted explanation traces to the intersection of the Old Kings Highway and the road to Ephrata, 2 major colonial-era routes. In 18th century English, intercourse was a completely standard word meaning communication, exchange, or the crossing of paths. Trade intercourse, commercial intercourse. The word appeared regularly in newspapers, legal documents, and congressional records without a single raised eyebrow. Thomas Jefferson used it in official correspondence. The Continental Congress used it in legislation. Nobody blinked. The language shifted. The town's name did not. Here is the fact that stops people cold. The community was formally named around 1754, making it older than the Declaration of Independence by over 2 decades. When the founders were debating liberty in Philadelphia, just 60 miles west, intercourse was already a functioning crossroads community with a post office, a tavern, and farmland being worked by families whose descendants still live there today. The tourism numbers are staggering and almost impossible to believe until you see them. Lancaster County draws roughly 8 million visitors annually, generating over $2 billion in economic activity. A significant portion of that traffic flows directly through intercourse. The town has a population of only about 1,300 permanent residents, meaning on peak summer weekends, tourists can outnumber locals by a ratio that would overwhelm most small communities entirely. And yet the Amish and Mennonite residents who form the backbone of this community have maintained their way of life with a consistency that is frankly remarkable given the commercial circus operating around them. What intercourse actually represents, beneath the jokes, beneath the tourism, beneath the merchandise, is one of the most extraordinary examples of cultural continuity in North America. A community that existed before this country did, that survived industrialization, urbanization, the automobile, the internet, and 270 years of outside pressure, and remains fundamentally itself. There is an entire layer of American history living quietly in Lancaster County that most people drive past on their way to photograph a sign. The kind of history this channel exists to find and bring back to you every single week before it disappears entirely. Number 8. Climax, Michigan. The town that made the post office famous for all the wrong reasons. There is a town in Michigan where the postmaster became, completely involuntarily, one of the most requested signatures in the American postal system, where people mailed letters from across the country not to receive anything back but purely for the cancellation stamp, where a single word on an envelope made grown adults giggle in post offices from California to Maine. And that word, printed in clean official government ink on every piece of outgoing mail, was Climax. Climax, Michigan is real. It has been real since 1828. And the origin of its name is genuinely contested, which makes it even more interesting than the joke suggests. The most commonly cited explanation is geographical. The area sits at what early surveyors identified as an elevated ridge, a high point in the surrounding Kalamazoo County landscape. In the early 19th century, climax was regularly used in formal English to describe a peak, a summit, or the highest point of something. It appeared in scientific writing, in sermons, in political speeches. When the township was organized and needed a name, somebody looked at the land, noted the elevation, and wrote down what they saw. Clean, logical, completely reasonable for 1828. What was not reasonable for 1828 or for any year the English language subsequently traveled through is what the word eventually came to mean in popular culture. And Climax, Michigan has been living with that evolution ever since. Here is the geography fact that reframes the whole story. Climax Township sits in Kalamazoo County in southwestern Michigan, roughly halfway between Kalamazoo and Battle Creek. This is not remote farmland. This is the agricultural and industrial corridor of Lower Michigan, a region that produced cereal empires, pharmaceutical giants, and paper manufacturing operations that supplied the entire country. Climax sits quietly in the middle of it, productive, functioning, completely unbothered. The township covers approximately 36 square miles. The population of roughly 7,000 makes it a legitimate community, not a ghost town, not a novelty settlement. It has a Climax Township Hall that handles real municipal governance, a Climax Community Park where families actually go, a fire department, a school district, real infrastructure doing real work. But the post office. The post office is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. For decades, the Climax, Michigan postmark became one of the most novelty-requested cancellation stamps in the entire United States postal system. Collectors mailed self-addressed envelopes from across the country just to receive them back, stamped with the Climax postmark. Valentine's Day created annual surges. The postmaster, a position of quiet municipal dignity in most American towns, became the unwilling custodian of a national inside joke. Letters arrived addressed to Climax from people who had no business in Michigan, no connection to the community, and no purpose beyond the stamp. Now here is the fact almost nobody outside Michigan knows, and this is the kind of detail that completely reframes a story. Climax Township is home to the Climax Antique Power Show, one of the largest antique farm equipment exhibitions in the Midwest. Held annually since 1968, it draws tens of thousands of visitors who come specifically to see restored steam engines, vintage tractors, and working demonstrations of agricultural machinery that powered American farming through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These are not museum pieces behind glass. They run. They move. They produce steam and noise and smoke in a field in Climax, Michigan, and the people who restore them have dedicated decades of their lives to the craft. The show has been running for over 50 years. It is a legitimate piece of American agricultural heritage. And it happens in a town most people only know as a punchline. That gap between what a place is known for and what it actually contains is the most consistent pattern in American geography. The name becomes the story. The real story disappears underneath it. And the real story is almost always more interesting. Climax also has the Climax Brewing Company, a business decision so perfectly on-brand that it either represents complete self-awareness or the total absence of it. Possibly both. The brewery operates. People visit. The merchandise sells itself without a single dollar spent on creative marketing. 9 years of minding its business before the state around it even had a name. The towns with the strangest names almost always have the straightest spines. And this channel keeps finding them in places most people only stop to photograph the sign. Number 7. Winnett, North Carolina. The town named by accident, governed by stubbornness, and forgotten by almost everyone. Somewhere in the Piedmont of North Carolina, there is a community that got its name because a room full of grown adults could not agree on anything else. Not a surveyor's error. Not a settler's surname. Not a geographic feature or a colonial-era road crossing. Winnett, North Carolina exists because exhaustion won an argument that logic couldn't finish. And that, in a country built as much on stubbornness as on vision, turns out to be one of the most American origin stories on this entire list. Winnett sits in Randolph County, in the central Piedmont region of North Carolina. Randolph County itself is older than the United States, established in 1779, 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, carved from the western frontier of what was then a brand new state still figuring out its own boundaries. The communities that grew inside it were built by Quakers, German settlers, and Scotch-Irish families who came down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania and pushed into the Carolina interior looking for land and distance from authority. These were not people who liked being told what to do. That detail matters enormously when you understand how Winnett got its name. The story, told consistently across local historical records and Randolph County archives, goes like this. Settlers gathered to name their community. Suggestions were made. Arguments followed. Every proposed name met resistance from someone in the room. The meeting dragged on. Patience collapsed. And at some point, the exact person is lost to history, which is itself perfect. Somebody said words to the effect of, "If we can't agree on anything else, why not just call it Winnett?" The room, presumably too tired to argue further, agreed. The name was submitted. The post office accepted it. And Winnett, North Carolina, was officially born from a collective shrug. This is verifiable in the sense that Randolph County historical records document the community and its naming tradition, and the story has been cited consistently by the County Historical Society without contradiction. It is the kind of origin that sounds fabricated precisely because it is too human to be invented. Now here is the geographical fact that most people completely miss when they hear about Winnett. Randolph County sits in the Uhori region of North Carolina, ancient, eroded mountains that are among the oldest geological formations in North America. The Uhori Mountains predate the Appalachians. They predate most mountain ranges on the entire continent. What remains today are worn-down ridges and forested hills that look modest from the road but are sitting on some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth, over 500 million years old in some formations. Winnett, a community of under 200 people that got its name from an argument nobody won, sits in the shadow of geology that makes the Rocky Mountains look like a recent renovation. The town has no traffic lights. It has no grocery store. It has no downtown in any recognizable commercial sense. What it has is a post office, which is the thread connecting it to official American geography, and a community of people who have, for generations, answered the question, "Where are you from?" with a response that stops conversations completely. Randolph County, where Winnett sits quietly and largely unnoticed, is home to the North Carolina Zoological Park, the largest natural habitat zoo in the United States by land area, covering over 2,600 acres. It is a state zoo of genuine international reputation, drawing over 700,000 visitors annually. It sits less than 15 miles from a community most of those visitors have never heard of. The contrast is almost architectural, one of America's most visited wildlife institutions, and 20 minutes away, a town of under 200 people named because nobody could agree on anything better. What makes Winnett genuinely compelling beyond the name, beyond the joke, is what it represents about small American communities in the rural Piedmont. Under 200 people. No commercial infrastructure. No tourist economy. No viral moment to put it on the map. Just a name that keeps surviving because the people attached to it keep surviving. That is a harder thing to maintain than it sounds. Hundreds of similarly sized communities across North Carolina have disappeared entirely, absorbed, unincorporated, forgotten, their names removed from maps that no longer had room for places that small. Winnett is still there, still answering mail, still making people stop mid-sentence when they hear the address for the first time. The places this small, this overlooked, and this stubbornly intact are exactly the ones that carry the deepest stories. And they are out there all across this country, waiting in counties most people drive through without slowing down. This channel slows down every single week, and what we find there is almost never what you'd expect. Number 6. Accident, Maryland. The town born from a royal blunder that shaped American property law. In 1751, two separate survey teams walked into the same forest in western Maryland and claimed the same land for two different men. Both were working legally. Both had valid warrants. Both had no idea the other existed. The collision of those two surveys, a bureaucratic catastrophe involving competing land grants from the colonial government of Maryland, produced a legal dispute that took years to untangle. And when it was finally resolved, the tract of land at the center of it all received an official name in the deed records. That name was the Accident Tract. The community that grew on top of it kept the name. It has kept it for over 270 years. Accident, Maryland is real. Population roughly 325. Garrett County, the westernmost county in Maryland, pressed against the borders of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, sitting in the Allegheny Mountains at an elevation that gives it some of the coldest winters in the entire state. The original survey conflict involved one Colonel Thomas Bourne, whose survey team claimed the land first under a warrant from the Maryland colonial government. A second party arrived shortly after with competing documentation. The resulting legal confusion was significant enough that when the deed was finally recorded, the tract name, Accident, was entered into official colonial land records and has appeared in every subsequent legal document involving that ground ever since. This is not folklore. The Accident Tract appears in Maryland colonial land records that are preserved and accessible through the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis. This town has an accident volunteer fire company, an accident elementary school, a main street that handles the full weight of that name without flinching. The town sits near Deep Creek Lake, Maryland's largest freshwater lake and one of the most visited recreational areas in the state, drawing hundreds of thousands of tourists annually, most of whom pass through Garrett County without realizing they are 20 minutes from a town whose name is encoded in 18th century royal land grant documentation. The kind of history hiding in plain sight across this country never stops being extraordinary. And this is exactly the kind of story most people never find, unless they know where to look. Now, we have reached the moment this list has been building toward. We are down to the top 5, and everything changes here. Because the first half of this list gave you names that were funny, names that were accidental, names that were stubbornly kept. But the top 5, these are something else entirely. These are the towns where the name doesn't just make you laugh. These are the towns where the name, once you understand the full story behind it, makes you feel something you weren't expecting to feel. Confusion, disbelief, and in the case of our number 1, something that sits uncomfortably close to genuine heartbreak. The towns get stranger. The stories get deeper. And number 1 is a place so surreally, perfectly, tragically named that when you hear the full story, you will want to tell someone about it before this video is even finished. Stay with us. It only gets more extraordinary from here. Number 5. Slaughterville, Oklahoma. The town that voted to keep the most alarming name in America. Twice. Most towns with uncomfortable names quietly rebrand. They hold a meeting, print new signage, update the municipal website, and move on. Slaughterville, Oklahoma had that exact opportunity. They voted on it. The community showed up, considered the question seriously, and then looked at each other and said no. Keep it. And then, when the question came back around years later, they said no again. Twice. By democratic vote. A community of real people, with real children filling out real school forms, decided that Slaughterville was worth defending. That decision deserves more examination than it usually gets. Leander Slaughter was appointed postmaster of a small Cleveland County community in the late 1800s, during the land rush era that transformed Oklahoma from Indian Territory into one of the most chaotically settled regions in American history. The Oklahoma Land Run of 1889, one of the most extraordinary events in the history of American westward expansion, brought over 50,000 settlers into unassigned lands in a single day. People literally raced on horseback, on foot, and by wagon to stake claims on land that had been opened by the federal government at noon on April 22. Cleveland County, where Slaughterville sits today, was directly in that territory. The community that formed around Leander Slaughter's post office was built on land claimed during one of the most dramatic land grabs in human history. His surname became the town's name through the standard postal naming conventions of the era. Nothing sinister, nothing theatrical, just a postmaster's last name on an official form. Then the language did what language does. It aged around the name without the name changing with it. Here is the fact that reframes Slaughterville's two votes entirely. Cleveland County, where Slaughterville sits, is home to the University of Oklahoma, one of the largest and most prominent public universities in the American South, located in Norman just miles away. This means Slaughterville exists in the orbit of a major research university, a college town with national athletic recognition, and a growing metropolitan area anchored by Oklahoma City to the north. This is not rural isolation. This is a community of 4,500 people choosing to keep an alarming name while sitting 20 minutes from one of Oklahoma's most sophisticated urban corridors. The name recognition has become economic. Local businesses have leveraged Slaughterville with the same commercial instinct that drives Intercourse's souvenir shops and Climax's brewery. The town holds a Slaughterville Founders Day. Merchandise exists. The name markets itself at zero cost because the reaction it produces is automatic and universal. What the two votes actually reveal is something deeper than humor. Community identity, once formed, resists correction even when correction is logical. The people of Slaughterville have absorbed their name so completely that changing it would feel like amputating something real. The name is uncomfortable to outsiders. To residents, it is simply home. That gap between outside perception and inside identity is one of the most consistent patterns in small-town American geography. And Slaughterville keeps governing, keeps growing, keeps signing official documents with a name that makes first-time readers look twice. Number 4, Oklahoma. The town named after baking powder that became the most philosophically confusing address in America. Oklahoma is a town named after a baking powder company that no longer exists, in a county most Americans couldn't locate on a map, with a population of roughly 600 people who have spent their entire lives explaining their address to people who assume they are being sarcastic. The company vanished. The town remained. And the name, two letters that represent the most frequently spoken expression in the English language, got permanently attached to a small community in Wagoner County that did absolutely nothing to deserve that level of existential confusion. The OK Baking Powder Company operated in the area in the early 1900s. When the town incorporated in 1919 and needed an official name for postal registration, the company's initials were the obvious choice. The post office approved it. Nobody apparently stopped to consider what would happen when the rest of the world eventually had to write OK Oklahoma on a mailing label and keep a straight face. Because that is the full legal mailing address. OK. A tautology so perfectly circular it reads like a philosophy exam answer written by someone who stopped caring. Here is the geographical fact that genuinely surprises people. Wagoner County, where OK sits, lies within the Three Forks region of Oklahoma, the historic confluence of the Arkansas, Grand, and Verdigris rivers. This was one of the most strategically significant waterway intersections in the entire American interior, used for centuries by indigenous nations including the Cherokee, who were forcibly relocated here from the American Southeast along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. One of the darkest forced migrations in American history passed directly through the region where a town named OK would later incorporate and name itself after baking powder. The post office cancellation stamp reads, OK, Oklahoma. It has been a novelty collector's item for decades. People mail letters specifically to receive it back. The water tower reads OK. The municipal signage reads OK. Every official communication produced by this town's government carries a built-in reassurance that nothing requested of it was ever too much trouble. 600 people live inside a word that the entire world uses approximately 1 billion times per day. And not one of them seems particularly bothered by that, which is honestly the most okay thing about all of it. Number 3, Ding Dong, Texas. the smallest town with the loudest name in the Lone Star State. There is a town in Texas with fewer than 40 residents. No grocery store, no traffic light, no commercial district of any kind, and a name that has appeared in travel magazines, comedy shows, and geography trivia contests across 4 continents. The store that gave it the name is gone. The bells on the sign that inspired it are gone. The owners who painted those words are gone. What remains is the name, a handful of residents, and a Bell County address so perfectly, absurdly constructed that it reads like something a novelist invented on a deadline. Ding Dong, Texas, Bell County. The address alone is a complete comedic sentence. Zuli's and Bert Bell operated a small general store in this unincorporated Central Texas community in the 1930s. Their sign, designed by a local artist named Bert and featuring 2 bells flanking the words Ding Dong, was a straightforward piece of rural advertising meant to catch the attention of passing travelers on a quiet road. It worked. The name stuck to the community the way names do in small Texas settlements, informally at first, then permanently, then officially enough that the post office recognized it and the map started printing it without quotation marks. Here is the geographical fact that makes Ding Dong genuinely extraordinary. Bell County, Texas sits in the heart of the Blackland Prairie, one of the most agriculturally productive soil regions in North America. The dark, calcium-rich clay that defines this landscape was so fertile that 19th-century farmers called it the most valuable farmland in Texas. Fort Hood, now called Fort Cavazos, one of the largest military installations on Earth, covering over 340 square miles and housing tens of thousands of active-duty soldiers, sits directly within Bell County. The largest military base in the world shares a county with a town of 40 people called Ding Dong. That contrast is not metaphorical. It is a geographical fact on an official Texas map. The Ding Dong post office receives thousands of novelty letters annually. The town sign gets stolen so regularly that locals have largely stopped replacing it permanently. Visitors photograph the area expecting something. A quirky shop, a themed diner, anything and find instead 40 people living quietly on the Blackland Prairie, completely unbothered by the attention their address generates. 40 people. One of the most recognizable town names in America. 0 apologies. If you have made it this far through this list and still haven't hit that notification bell, I genuinely don't know what you're waiting for. We just found a town of 40 people in the shadow of the world's largest military base named Ding Dong. It gets stranger. We just have 2 towns left. And it is the one that will actually stop you cold. Number 2, Nameless, Tennessee. The town that wanted a name, got rejected every single time, and ended up with the most haunting address in America. The federal government told this community no so many times that the community eventually gave up and submitted the one name nobody could reject because nobody else had been desperate enough to use it yet. Nameless, Tennessee is not a nickname. It is not a joke. It is the official, federally recognized, legally documented name of a real community in Jackson County, Tennessee, appearing on United States postal records, county maps, and government documentation exactly as written. Nameless. Population fewer than 100. Established in the late 1800s when the community applied for a post office, the standard pathway to official recognition for rural American settlements, and submitted name after name to federal postal authorities. Each one returned rejected because another community somewhere in Tennessee had already claimed it. The rejection process was not unusual. The United States Post Office Department maintained strict rules against duplicate place names within states to prevent mail misrouting. Communities across rural America regularly had their preferred names bounced back. Most found alternatives. Nameless, Tennessee ran out of alternatives first. So they submitted Nameless, and Washington approved it immediately. Here is the fact that makes this genuinely haunting. Jackson County, where Nameless sits, is one of the most overlooked counties in all of Tennessee, a rugged, heavily forested stretch of the Cumberland Plateau where small communities formed along creek hollows and ridge lines throughout the 1800s, and many of them quietly disappeared before the 20th century ended. Nameless survived. Surrounded by communities that are now truly nameless, unrecorded, unincorporated, absorbed back into the landscape, the town that was forced to call itself Nameless is the one that kept its post office, kept its identity, and kept its place on the map. A community that wanted nothing more than a real name ended up with the only name that guaranteed it would never be forgotten. That is either the cruelest irony in American geography or the most perfect accidental poetry. Possibly both. Number 1. Embarrass, Minnesota. The town with the most socially uncomfortable name in America. It also holds the most brutal weather record in the continental United States. On February 2, 1996, a thermometer in this small Minnesota community Red -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Not wind chill. Not feels like. Actual recorded air temperature. -60. The kind of cold that freezes exposed skin in under a minute, that makes diesel engines refuse to start, that turns breath into ice crystals before it travels 6 inches from your face. It was the coldest temperature ever officially recorded in the contiguous 48 states outside of Alaska. And the town where it happened was called Embarrass. Embarrass. Minnesota did not choose that name out of resignation or humor or bureaucratic exhaustion. The name arrived with French fur traders and voyagers who paddled through this region of northeastern Minnesota in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Embarrass River, which the community sits beside, was named using the French verb embarrasser, meaning to obstruct or encumber. The river was legendarily choked with fallen timber, tangled deadwood, and debris that made navigation genuinely treacherous. French explorers named it practically, professionally, and accurately. The community that eventually formed on its banks inherited the name without ceremony. Embarrass sits in St. Louis County, the largest county east of the Mississippi River by land area, covering over 6,000 square miles of the Minnesota Iron Range. This is the region that produced the iron or that built American cities, manufactured American warships, and supplied the steel industry that defined the 20th century economy. The mines of the Iron Range sent raw material to the same Gary, Indiana furnaces, and Braddock, Pennsylvania plants we have explored on this channel before. It sits quietly at the edge of all that industrial legacy, holding a weather record most cities would find unimaginable and wearing a name that makes strangers uncomfortable on its behalf. The residents of Embarrass are not embarrassed. They never were. The name was never theirs to begin with. It belonged to a river, and before that to a language, and before that to the fallen trees that made passage difficult for people who had no intention of staying. They stayed anyway, in -60 degrees, without embarrassment, without apology. America named a town after baking powder, after a surveying argument, after complete bureaucratic exhaustion, after a bell sign on a country road that no longer exists. And every single one of those towns is still standing, still governed, still mailing letters, still raising children who write those addresses on school forms without flinching. The names didn't survive because they were good. They survived because the people underneath them were stubborn enough to outlast every reason to quit. That stubbornness is the most American thing on this entire list. And here is what keeps me up at night. There are thousands more. Towns with names so strange, history so buried, stories so extraordinary that they are sitting right now on a road you have driven past without slowing down. Every week this channel finds another one. Every week something genuinely extraordinary surfaces from a county most people cannot locate on a map. If you are not subscribed, you are not just missing videos. You are missing the version of America that nobody else is documenting. The one disappearing quietly while everyone looks elsewhere. Next week we are going somewhere darker and stranger. 10 ghost towns that are technically, legally, officially still alive, still on maps, still holding zip codes, still recognized by governments that have largely forgotten why. Some of them still have residents. One of them still has a mayor. Make sure you don't miss that one.